In 2010, representatives of the Japanese government were on their way to the home of Sogen Kato, the oldest man in Tokyo at the time. The plan was to publicly celebrate the man's 111th birthday, but they'd also tried to get in touch with him a few times before this. Once to check in about his pension fund, which they hadn't been able to reach him about, and then another time on Respect for the Aged Day, which is a national holiday in Japan when the media and the local government tends to feature the oldest people in the area. Finally, after multiple times of being shooed away from the home by relatives, officials became so concerned about Kato that police entered the house and broke into his first floor bedroom, where they found him skeletal and mummified. Later, it was estimated that Kato had been dead since 1978. They quickly turned their attention to 113-year-old Fusa Furuya, who was Tokyo's oldest known woman. The address on file for Furuya was at her daughter's house, but when they got there to ask about the oldest woman alive, Furuya's daughter told officials that she hadn't seen her mother in 25 years. Very suddenly and alarmingly, it became excruciatingly clear that Japan had a problem. They simply could not know for sure whether the 234,354 people over the age of 100 that they assumed were alive were actually still around or not. Meanwhile, 11 years earlier and across the globe in Europe, Italian medical doctor Gianni Pes from the University of Sassari presented unique findings at the 1999 Demography Conference in Montpellier. Now, demography is the statistical study of human populations, and it tracks things like births and deaths and ethnic groups and migration. Gianni had been working on a project called Akia, which was a name taken from the Sardinian expression that translates to "may you live to be 100." What his team sought to investigate was that they noticed that so many people in Sardinia were living to the age of 100, and he'd found 13 centenarians per 100,000 people there, which is higher than the average of 11.6. The Montpellier Conference was the starting point for research into blue zones, or areas of the world where people seem to live longer than they do anywhere else. You've no doubt heard of blue zones because they get a ton of media coverage. At this point in time, we have multiple recognized blue zones, and there are 5 of them. They're Okinawa, Japan, Icaria, Greece, Sardinia, Italy, Nicoya, Costa Rica, and Loma Linda, California. There are countless Blue Zone articles and videos and interviews with ancient, wrinkly faces, and even Netflix came out with a documentary series on Blue Zones in 2023 that you may have seen. Supposedly, you have the most centenarians in these places, or mimas and papas who live to be over 100. They also have the most super centenarians, or people who live to be 110 or over. If you throw a rock in a blue zone, you're just always going to hit the oldest person in the world. And researchers and the public alike are just obsessed with these mysterious, magical, reverse Bermuda Triangle hotspots around the globe. And the longevity of people in the blue zones has been attributed to a few different possible causes, from the culture of the regions in question to the diets and eating habits of those regions. Blue zones equate to big money in wellness circles because they give fodder to influencers and longevity gurus like Brian Johnson. And I talked about Johnson in a recent video about the science behind whether it's lifestyle factors or genetics that really determines how long you're going to live. But there is a massive, massive problem with all of this, and that is that blue zones might actually be just as real as the Bermuda Triangle, which is to say, not real at all. What we're going to do some good about today is we're going to follow up with our story from the top of the video about the surprise dead man in Japan, and we're going to move on into Greece and Costa Rica, and then into these United States of America, and we're going to find out whether or not blue zones are actually real. We're also going to find out if there are any lessons we can take from them, or the reasons behind their invention to change the way we think about longevity and our own health. When the Montpellier Conference in '99 broke for coffee at one point, one group of scientists met up and began debating the merits of this Sardinian data. The group quickly singled out Belgian demographer Michel Poulain, who they thought would do a perfect job of fact-checking the research because Poulain was known at the time as an expert in age verification. Poulain was into the idea, so he hooked up with the presenter, Gianni Pes, and took him along as he gallivanted across Ogliastra, which is a province inside the autonomous island region of Sardinia. The pair went to 40 different towns and villages to check on how old people were doing there and to try to verify the ages of the very oldest among them. And they marked the places with the most promising findings with a blue blue pen, hence the origin of the term blue zone. Surprisingly, they found the highest concentration of centenarians in the rural, socioeconomically barren, mountainous regions of Nuoro province. They published a paper in 2004 about their findings, which would go on to catch fire and really jumpstart research into blue zones inside the academic community. Now, crossing the world again, this time to the United States, a man named Dan Buettner was about to set off on some parallel research of his own. The only issue being that Buettner wasn't a researcher. At that point, he was just a charismatic online presence who was doing fun digital content about interesting mysteries around the world. Because of the platform he was building, he managed to get himself an invite to Okinawa, Japan, where he'd come across a new mystery for his personal digital content operation. And that was that it appeared that people in Okinawa were living extraordinarily long lives in comparison to people living in the rest of Japan. And after his initial visit to Okinawa, Buettner pitched National Geographic with an idea about investigating hotspots around the world where people seem to live the longest. At this point, he'd been leading trips to these places where he found that people were experiencing some serious longevity, places like Okinawa and Sardinia, and randomly Loma Linda, California. You might think that that one is just a little out of place and sort of off for some reason, and you'd be right. We're definitely coming back to it. Buettner wrote about the places he visited in an article that ran as the cover story for the November 2005 edition of National Geographic, and the article was called Secrets of Long Life. This really got the ball rolling in the popular culture, and the idea of blue zones began gaining serious traction at this point. And this is also when the main characters who were working in the space began to converge and compare notes. Buettner began collaborating with demographer Michel Poulain to identify more blue zones, and together with Gianni Pes, they investigated and confirmed new longevity hotspots in Nicoya, Costa Rica, and Ikaria, Greece. In 2008, Buettner landed a book deal about blue zones and went on to publish an account of the team's travels called The Blue Zones: Lessons for Living Longer from the People Who've Lived the Longest, which was published by National Geographic Books. In 2015, he got another book deal, this time a cooking and diet guide for longevity based on his evaluations of what people in blue zones were eating. This one was called The Blue Zone Solutions: Eating and Living Like the World's Healthiest People, and that became a New York Times bestseller. Then, of course, in 2023, we had the release of the Netflix documentary series they did with Buettner called Live to 100: Secrets of the Blue Zones. Leading up to the creation of the series, Buettner had released 7 best-selling books, including longevity guides and cookbooks, and he put out cooking courses based on the food of the blue zones, and he became a very sought-after paid speaker. Buettner had trademarked the term blue zone all the way back in 2005. In defense of that trademark, Buettner said that people had just begun to use the term for their own benefit, and he was simply defending it and reserving it for the valid use of promoting the cultures that he was exploring. Quote, "Unless you protect the term, anybody can use it in the way they want," he said. Today, cities and towns can hire Buettner's Blue Zones LLC company to guide their municipal policy toward meeting the standards for obtaining a Blue Zone Community Certificate. Blue Zones LLC is, quote, dedicated to creating healthy communities across the United States. The main qualifications and infrastructure tweaks are fine ideas. They're just very benign things like making areas more walkable and more community focused. Buettner sold Blue Zones LLC in 2020, but he's still listed as a consultant for the company. Some researchers began to get a little antsy around this point, and they pointed to the fact that Michel Poulain being on board was really the only thing that they could point to that was giving any of this some real academic standing. Because without his involvement, the whole Blue Zones thing was starting to look like a pretty standard money-making venture, even bordering on a possible wellness grift. And very awkwardly, that's also around the time that Michel Poulain backed out of the project. The once celebrated demographer decided to break away when Buettner approached him to testify in a lawsuit that he wanted to bring against Chanel because they'd made a fragrance called Blue Serum that evoked something of a Blue Zone vibe. Poulain outright refused to support Buettner's new crusade, and he just walked away from the partnership. By the time the Netflix series aired, Poulain was gone. When he commented on the series, the only thing he said was, "I don't appear. Just at one moment, you can see me from afar." And just like that, without the illusion of academic rigor, the cracks in the magical world of blue zones began to appear. Of course, you can easily argue that just because something makes money doesn't automatically make it a bad idea. Lots of things that do a whole lot of good in the world are profitable for somebody. We can, however, put some clues together here from the scale of the main purveyor of Blue Zone ideology, and then even more importantly, we can also definitively pinpoint whether or not there's any real scientific backing to any of it. And this brings us back to the story of Sogen Kato from the top of the video. Kato's family collected $117,939 in pension funds from his career as a teacher over the course of the decades where Kato himself lay mummified in his bedroom. He also would have received a senior welfare benefit after turning 70. Kato's granddaughter was sentenced to 2.5 years for fraud and ultimately had to pay back the stolen pension money. After the long-dead remains of Kato were found and Fusa Furuya was also found missing, Japan launched a big investigation that uncovered the alarming fact that 80% of the country's centenarians were actually already dead. The very next year, in 2011, Greece was going through a series of fiscal austerity measures to weather a major recession. One of the things that this led Greek officials to investigate was pension fraud. And in doing so, they found out that almost all of their supposed centenarians were dead too. In the 2011 census, because of the investigation and the fact that Greek authorities actually took the time to look into it and, count, they found that 3/4 of the country's population of people aged 100 and up completely vanished. Poof. Just like old people magic. In the case of Greece, that was 2% of the entire population, which is a little nuts. And one researcher was paying attention to all of this closely enough to start connecting the dots. And that was the 2024 winner of the Ig Nobel Prize, Dr. Saul Newman of Oxford University. Now, the stated mission of the Ig Nobel Prize is to, quote, first make people laugh and then make them think. Newman won the prize for the research that he did that demonstrates that most of the centenarians in blue zones are actually dead. Quote, they're only alive on pension day. But even sillier than all that, and much less malicious, maybe, is the fact that Newman points out that a lot of blue zone longevity assumptions simply come down to faulty record keeping. Let's take a look at the example of Jiroman Kimura, the world's oldest recorded man, who made it to 116 years of age before he died in 2013. Kimura was born in a fishing village in April or May of 1897. He graduated from elementary school in 1907 and 1909 and 1911. He married his wife also on 3 different dates, and he may have adopted her last name, and he definitely at one point maybe changed his first name because his birth name is totally different. Maybe you're getting why things are too sketchy for researchers like Saul Newman at this point. Because demographers who verified Kimura's records specifically have stated that they found, quote, no critical discordances in his files. So just the non-critical stuff, like nobody knows when he graduated from school, or when he got married, or was born, or what his name was. And it's not a matter of some isolated cases that just look a little fishy either, because you could absolutely look at this one person and just dismiss all of the criticism. In Okinawa, there's a definitive split in longevity for people born before the year 1945 and people born after 1945. Okinawans who were born before 1945 have a life expectancy that's lower than the rest of Japan, whereas Okinawans born after 1945 seem to have a remarkable longevity to the point that it was hailed as one of the original blue zones, reporting twice as many centenarians as the whole rest of the country. Did something happen in 1945 that could account for this discrepancy, just from a practical standpoint, just from the perspective of records and accounting and paper documents? A little thing called World War II happened, and the firebombing of Tokyo, in addition to the destruction of every major city in the entire country of Japan. Okinawa was absolutely leveled during the war, and up to 1/4 of the civilian population were killed. The Koseki, or the Japanese family register, which records births and deaths and such, was totally annihilated in the war. And the current data we have now is from a civil registry that was actually reassembled by US authorities through interviews during the American occupation of Japan. And this wasn't just a case of people misreporting their age, which likely happened, sure, either deliberately or accidentally, but they were also battling against a serious language barrier and also the traditional Japanese calendar that was different from the Gregorian calendar that was used in the West. Then there was also a welfare benefits system created after the war for people who were struggling, and benefits were doled out based on age. And a lot of Okinawans put in requests for their ages to be updated. And as the New Yorker reported, there is a strong correlation between the number of requests made in a village and the supposed lifespan of its residents. In other words, people pretended to be older so that they could receive more in benefits money. And they probably needed that money, but also that means that we have faulty records of how old they actually are. Newman says that people who are living the longest around the world don't actually have extreme longevity. What they have, he says, is a birth certificate allergy. Case in point, in the United States of America, after birth certificates became a standard thing in the year 1900, the number of centenarians suddenly plummeted. The exact same thing happened in Japan and in Greece when they actually investigated the genuine ages of their oldest people and realized that most of them were dead. Fortune magazine tells us that the exact same thing happened also in Costa Rica, where the Nicoya Peninsula is another supposed blue zone. Research from 2008 showed that 42% of centenarians in Costa Rica lied about their age in the census. And you might think, well, that's just a problem in other places around the world now where infrastructure just isn't top-notch, but you would be wrong. The United States Census Bureau has said that millions of Americans lied about their age in the most recent census too. Millions. Maybe you're thinking, what's the big deal? Who cares if a few people lie about their age? How does that refute the idea that blue zones have higher populations of older people? Newman put out a thought experiment that showcases just how tricky this makes it to research aging populations. He tells us to suppose that 100 40-year-olds fake their ages and record their age as 50 instead of 40. If you have 100,000 50-year-olds inside a country, the fake 50-year-olds would only make up 0.1% of the population. But then every year, those fake 50-year-olds are less likely to die than the actual 50-year-olds. So they start to make up more and more of the population of their age group within the country, even though they're not really that age. At 66, they'll be 0.4% of their age group. At 80, they'll be 3% of their age group. And because of the high rate of risk of death that increases exponentially as you get older, at 105 years old, they would be pretty much the entire population of their age group. And that's where the problem is with blue zones. It's worth noting that James Volpel, who was one of the original attendees at the Montpellier Demography Conference in '99, just immediately flagged the fact that the research findings from Sardinia weren't about health and longevity at all, but were just caused by faulty record keeping. Of course, he was ignored and the fad exploded. At this point, if you're still skeptical and you're still thinking that blue zones are probably real despite the math, that's okay, because we still haven't dived into the proposed health benefits of their diets and cultures. Okinawa is the poorest region of Japan, with the lowest socioeconomic indicators, including high poverty rate at 35%, which is twice the national average, combined with low wages. Okinawa is number 1 in Japan for consumption of Kentucky Fried Chicken and dead last in consumption of things you'd think are good for you, like leafy greens, sweet potatoes, and seafood, even though those things are inexplicably on the Blue Zone eating guide for Okinawa. Okinawan people have the highest body mass index across the entire nation, and over a third of men there are smokers. Newman says he gets asked a lot about the Mediterranean diet, which, unless you've been living in a cave made entirely of chocolate, the Mediterranean diet is probably the biggest food fad that there is in popular culture, hands down. He says it came about due to someone noticing the extreme numbers of centenarians in the records in southern Italy, which jives with the original exploration in Sardinia. But Newman immediately wondered why there would be so many 100-year-olds reported there when southern Italy is a region where people have relatively shorter lifespans. especially in comparison to northern Italy, where people actually tend to live longer than those who eat the foods that inspired the Mediterranean diet. And in one interview with the Australian National University's School of Science and Medicine, Newman was asked if it really was just the minestrone soup providing these extraordinary longevity results in southern Italy. No, he said, it's probably got a lot to do with bad record keeping and the mafia, because that's where pension fraud happens. In 1997, there were 30,000 living pension recipients found to be dead in Italy. And then he went on to talk about Greece, which was actually the third or fourth overweight country in Europe at the time when the Blue Zone studies were conducted. To come in and pretend that their diet should be emulated is absurd. The other thing he pointed out to ANU is that the regions themselves have a vested interest in keeping the curtain from falling because they get a lot of tourist attention for being on the list of global blue zones. They have tourism infrastructure set up to meet the specific demand of people visiting because of the proposed health benefits of the area. Science.org did a study on the faulty Blue Zone data in 2024, and they interviewed Ross Brownson, a public health researcher at Washington University in St. Louis. Brownson notes that the health ideas behind Blue Zones are, quote, good, safe messages that I don't think many public health experts would argue with, and that the Blue Zone program that cities and towns can pay the Blue Zone LLC company to put them through, quote, is sort of like standard public health promotion 101. But then there are also some obvious things, too, that really go against the data on human health that we have today. Like the fact that one of the Blue Zone recommendations is that people drink 2 glasses of wine every day. We know now that no amount of alcohol is good for you, whether that's wine or beer or Smirnoff Ice. And I went over the research behind that revelation in the video I did about why so many people aren't drinking anymore. Newman also commented on this in his interview with ANU. Quote, well, the Blue Zone guy has been telling people to drink wine every day. Every day! That's a recipe for alcoholism, and he's got no qualifications whatsoever. And just to interject here, it's not fair to say that Buettner has no qualifications. He does have a bachelor's degree in Spanish. But no, he has no qualifications that would back up any of his investigatory work in the area of longevity. That was why it was so important to have Poulain on board. The other thing that seems completely out of step here is that Blue Zones and the Blue Zone program have no recommendations at all when it comes to smoking. Critics rightly point out that smoking is one of the most harmful things that you can do to yourself. As we've seen, some Blue Zone populations are very prominently filled with smokers. That's definitely both a misstep in terms of public health recommendations and a flaw in the logic about the data behind the longevity of people in those areas. Dr. Newman mused about this in his interview with ANU. Quote, where are all the athletes, he asked. The aerobically svelte, annoyingly pious, scare you with their abs types. Dead, he said. According to Newman, the reason that people live to be 100 or 110 or longer in these areas and still do everything wrong, like they drink and they smoke and they eat unhealthy foods, well, the reason is that they've actually been dead for a long time. Toward the end of Dr. Newman's interview with ANU, he sums this up by saying, quote, more important than whether the Blue Zone lifestyle prescriptions are good or bad for you is the fact that they're just not true. It's cultural appropriation without any connection to reality. Now, the only way to really solve this officially and put an end to Blue Zones with absolute certainty would be to invent better methods of determining biological age through testing. There are some ways to do this out there, but none of them can yet pinpoint someone's chronological age. Steve Horvath is one aging researcher who's made his own test that involves a methylation clock called Grim Age, and he says these techniques aren't going to tell you if someone is 115 instead of 120. They can only do things like catch egregious cases of fraud, like when a child were to take on their parent's identity, for example. So we can't reliably determine someone's age through testing. And even though that's true, it seems like we have a pretty solid amount of evidence to suggest that Blue Zones aren't actually real things. One of them we know for sure isn't a real thing, and that one is Loma Linda, California. Remember how I said we'd come back to Loma Linda? Because it seemed a little weird, just a little out of place? Loma Linda became a Blue Zone when Buettner was doing his work for National Geographic because his editor just wanted there to be a Blue Zone in the United States. That's it. That's how 1 out of the 5 places became an official Blue Zone. And for me, that incident might just sum up the whole thing. The guy who really popularized Blue Zones to the point that he trademarked the term Blue Zones made up a blue zone so that he could publish work about blue zones for profit. The thing about scientific research is that even in the case that you find some that compromises integrity and reality for the sake of a profit motive, eventually someone is going to come along to peer review those results and overturn them, especially in a crowded field. And if the blue zone wellness and diet fad had been approached from a more academic angle, we might not have had all these books and documentaries about it, because we would have seen much earlier on that most of the world's oldest people weren't actually even still alive. Check out my Patreon page for a bonus Jonas about this episode, including some cool cultural tidbits like Sogen Kato allegedly attempting to mummify himself while still alive into something called a living Buddha. And stick around here for the other video I did on longevity science and whether it's genetics or lifestyle factors that really determine our health and how long we're going to live. You can also pre-order Dr. Saul Newman's new book, Morbid, at the link down in the didgeridoo, where you can also find all of my sources, as always, for this video. And if you like this video, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel for more just like it. And before I see you next time, make sure to try your best to do some fucking good in your own little sphere of influence in the world. Maybe someday I can live to 100 and my house can become a wellness retreat oasis where people teach workshops on how to do things like count old people better. Forget blue zones, we'll call it the blue hair zone. A bunch of blue hairs eating sweet potatoes and counting their friends.